Welcome back to lecture number 47. We are starting a new historical period, that is period 6. It's going to take us from 1865 to 1898. And this first lecture is meant to contextualize everything that happened. So the learning objective is going to be explain the historical context for the rise of industrial capitalism in the United States. This industrial capitalism is going to be one of the largest events that happens in period 6. So technological advances, large-scale production methods, and the opening of new markets encouraged the rise of industrial capitalism in the United States. So right from the get-go, we're answering this learning objective. The technological advances, one of the biggest ones was the Bessemer process. This was a better and cheaper way to make steel, and steel was driving this industrial expansion with railroads and factories. And the opening of new markets refers to the Western markets. So now that railroads are being laid down, connecting markets in California to the Midwest and the East Coast, there are more people buying products. There's also overseas expansion into new markets. In Hawaii, the fruit growers overthrow the monarchy in attempts to make Hawaii a U.S. state. And this new era of industrialization is followed by large businesses with mega rich captains of industry, or some people would call them robber barons, for the amount of money that they made being made on the backs of the poor working class that they were not paying as much money as they would have deserved. The examples of these are Andrew Carnegie in the steel industry, J.D. Rockefeller in oil, and JP Morgan in banking. So there's two perspectives on the leaders of industry or captains of industry. There's a positive one, so those people would call them captains of industry, and the negative one, people would call them robber barons. So you can see the political cartoon on the bottom left has a negative view of them. All right, large-scale industrial production accompanied by massive technological change, expanding international communication networks, and a pro-growth government policy which generated rapid economic development and business consolidation. So pro-growth government policies that we see are government contracts given to private companies, government subsidies given to especially the railroads in the form of land grants, and a lack of regulation. The development is going to be very widespread in the north. So the map on the top left shows you the wealth in the United States in 1872. The darker yellow areas are more wealthy, and the lighter areas are less wealthy. So the South was still struggling with Reconstruction or trying to recover from the Civil War. There were proponents for a new South to also bring the South into this new industrialization age, but it didn't quite work out. Business consolidation means that companies are getting larger and they are buying up competitors, making monopolies. So in the steel and the oil industry, in the railroad industry, we see more monopolies, and they're able to consolidate through what is called vertical and horizontal integration. With vertical integration, they are able to control every step of the process of making one product, and with horizontal integration, they are able to control the entire market share for one product or one type of industry by buying up other competitors. So a variety of perspectives on the economy and labor developed during a time of financial panics and downturns. In terms of the economy, the farmers, the people living in rural areas, they had a lot to say. They were experiencing large debts, falling prices on their crops, and also deflation, meaning that the amount of money was more valuable, or any amount of money was more valuable because there was a lack of it. And so they were advocating for an inflationary policy, meaning that they want more money to be put into the money supply, and so therefore the value of it goes down, making it easier for them to pay back their debts. They proposed doing this by coining silver in addition to gold, and also using paper notes, as we had in the Civil War. With labor, all the people that are working in these factories getting paid low wages, they begin to join labor unions. The first example is the National Labor Union. Then we see the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor were a catch-all labor union for anyone to join, and they end up losing membership after one of the large strikes, the Haymarket Square strike. And the American Federation of Labor is still around today. They are, as the name suggests, a federation of labor unions. That means that it's not individuals who join, but it is different labor unions that joined, or smaller labor unions that join this larger federation of unions. And then financial panics. We have two really big ones in 1873 and 1893. And panics in this times are going to be caused by over speculation on land and railroad company stocks, because as people believe that the value of these two things are going to go up, they create bubbles, and then the bubbles burst, leading to great panics. So new systems of production and transportation enabled consolidation within agriculture, which along with periods of instability spurred a variety of responses from farmers. We see a mechanization of farming. So it is now faster and also now more expensive to be a farmer. And it leads to a growing indebtedness to those who remain in the profession of farming. Those that end up using these new machines get higher crop yields, and because the crops are more plentiful, it leads to a depreciation of their prices. So these lower crop prices makes it harder for farmers to pay back their debts that they've used to buy the land, to buy this new machinery, and their response to the falling lower prices is to just plant more crops, which creates this cycle of lower prices. So farmers get together and they create alliances and cooperatives, the first one being the Grange. These would create cooperatives in grain elevators and ways to store the grain before they sell it on market, to try and battle all the other things that were working against the farmers in making money or making a profit. For the Farmers Alliance, they were focused really on bringing about political change and creating political parties or lobbying politicians to create legislation that was going to benefit the farmers, like regulating the rates that railroads would charge farmers for transporting their crops from one place to another. All right, so domestic migration and the migrations that accompanied industrialization transforms both urban and rural areas of the United States and caused dramatic social and cultural change. So we see a huge rise in cities. This is where immigrants are settling, but it's also where people that were living in rural areas are now going to find wage labor. The population is growing faster than the infrastructure can really handle at this time. You can see that in the bottom left and the top left, it's a very crowded situation, especially where a lot of migrants are living. They're living 6, 7, 8 people to one small room. Jacob Riis, who is an early reformer, wrote a book called How the Other Half Lives, and in addition to the book, he included photographs and illustrations of what the conditions were like in New York City, and then these two pictures that you see in front of you are pictures from his book, How the Other Half Lives. During this time, it was said that the frontier, the western frontier, had now been filled, now that all of the United States have been populated from New York to California. Frederick Jackson Turner was a historian and social commentator who wrote this thesis on the frontier. His belief was that the frontier had always been a source of innovation. It had been a pressure release valve where people would go when they couldn't make it in the urban areas, or when they couldn't make it in the East Coast. They could always have an opportunity to try and make it on their own in the frontier. But now that the frontier has been, in his mind, closed, there's nowhere for those people to go anymore, that they're going to stay in the urban area where they were. And given that the frontier was the source of innovation, now that the frontier has been closed, that innovation may not be there anymore. And so now we may need to look for a new frontier, which may be Canada or Mexico or other foreign places that the United States can expand into. All right, so for international migration, it increased urban populations and fostered the growth of a new urban culture. So the new wave of immigration is largely Southern and Eastern European, and they're settling in the East Coast. This is different than the first wave of immigration, which, by the way, is still happening. There's still Irish and German immigrants coming in, but not at the same level as the Southern and Eastern Europeans. So Italians, Greeks, and then Russians are mostly Jews who are escaping pogroms in Russia or Eastern Europe. They settled mostly in cities, and because they're all together in one place and there's a lot of them, they start to experience a new wave of nativism. Now, on the East Coast, we had Chinese immigrants that were working on railroads, and they are also experiencing nativism because they are perceived to be taking jobs away from white Americans. And so in 1882, Congress passes the Chinese Exclusion Act. Island and Angel Island in the West Coast are these new immigration funnels where immigrants have to first register and check in through and possibly be turned back around if they don't meet the criteria for the immigration laws that are now being passed and more common. And for land in the West, we have larger numbers of migrants moving to the West in search of land and economic opportunity, frequently provoking competition and violent conflict. So homesteaders who were taking land starting in 1862 are going out west, but most homesteaders are receiving poor land with little rainfall. The really good land was really going to speculators and to railroad companies. And so most people who were homesteaders would fail within the 5-year period and either have to buy land from a speculator or go back to the East Coast. Railroads and mining, they made migration possible. Towns would spring up along the rail lines, or they would spring up around a mineral deposit, so that would be called a boom town. And then once all of the mineral deposits had been removed through mining, whether it was gold or silver or iron ore, then the boom town would become a ghost town because people would leave. There'd be no more reason for people to be there. There are still ghost towns all over the West today. And conflicts with natives. So now we have conflicts with Plains Indians, specifically the Sioux in the Northwest. And there are battles that the U.S. Army is fighting with leaders of the Sioux, like Crazy Horse and the Battle of Little Bighorn. George Custer, who had also been a Civil War veteran, is pursuing a Sioux band, and in his attack, he gets surrounded and ambushed by a band of warriors led by Crazy Horse. An image of it or illustration is seen on the top right, and Custer is killed in this battle. And so the U.S. Army, having made many changes since the Civil War and growing and updating its weaponry and being more mobile because of the railroads, will eventually win in these battles with Native Americans. They will dispossess the natives of their land, put them in reservations, and then with the Dawes Act of 1887, they will allocate the land that natives have and put them into reservations. So with new wave of reformers, the Gilded Age produced new cultural and intellectual movements, public reform efforts, and political debates over economic and social policies. Intellectual movements, they were diverse. So conservation, this deals with nature. Yellowstone National Park was designated the first national park in the 1870s. We have social Darwinism with Herbert Spencer on the bottom left taking ideas from Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution, and Booker T. Washington, who was a civil rights advocate, proposing his Atlantic Compromise and trying to get African Americans to do the best that they can in this segregated world and start with a trade education and then move up from there, and then hopefully then after that whites would see them as more equal and give them more equality in social settings. For public reforms, we have the Gospel of Wealth with Andrew Carnegie. He believed that he should be, or all other rich, wealthy people should give away their wealth to those who need it in philanthropic endeavors. The social gospel was a movement that was trying to apply Protestant ideas to help others, help people who are in need. And we see suffrage again and temperance again with the NAWSA and Susan B. Anthony and the Women's Christians Temperance Union. We have political and economic debates. The rise of populism we'll talk more extensively about, but that will really revolve around the issue of money and inflationary policies and coining silver. So greenbacks, tariffs, coining silver, we'll see all of that later. And intellectual movements, new cultural and intellectual movements both buttressed and challenged the social order of the Gilded Age. So for cultural movements, we have the growth of popular culture, we have the growth of press and newspapers. Sports like baseball are being watched, college football, the circus with Barnum and Bailey, Buffalo Bills, Wild West is a large variety show which takes elements of Native American life and the West, and he really popularizes the idea of the Wild West. The architecture, we have architects like Frank Lloyd Wright that are starting their work. Literature, Mark Twain is a great example of these realist writers, and Jack London is a really good example of the naturalist writers. Helen Hunt Jackson writes her book, A Century of Dishonor, talking about how the United States government has treated Native Americans for the past 100 years and is advocating for change. So in intellectual movements, we have Progress and Poverty, written by Henry George. That was a book talking about how the cities and the way the current system was only going to lead to poverty for those who were at the very bottom. With social Darwinism, we talked about Herbert Spencer applying the ideas of Charles Darwin to people. And finally, the assimilation movement for Native Americans with Indian schools. So Indian schools were meant to assimilate Native American children to become white citizens. So the Carlisle Industrial School for Indians was the most famous example. The person who started the Carlisle Indian School had been a U.S. Army veteran from the Civil War, and his motto was to kill the Indian but save the man. So they had a, again, very racialized view of what people should act like and what Native Americans should be doing with their land and with their future. All right. So we have dramatic social changes in the period, inspired political debates over citizenship, corruption, and the proper relationship between business and government. So we still have segregation from the previous historical period, and in this case we have a Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson, that upholds this idea of separate but equal, of segregation. And the Chief Justice, or the Supreme Court Justice, John Marshall Harlan, just as he had opposed the outcome of the civil rights cases, which weakened the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, he opposes here with Plessy versus Ferguson, and he writes that everyone knows that the statute in question had its origin and the purpose not so much to exclude white people from railroad cars occupied by blacks as to exclude colored people from coaches occupied by or assigned to white persons. The thing to accomplish was, under the guise of giving equal accommodation for whites and blacks, to compel the latter to keep to themselves while traveling in railroad passenger coaches. No one would be so wanting in candor as to assert to the contrary. So he was calling this policy of separate but equal racist, and that it was very clear, and anyone that was trying to deny it was trying to fool themselves. We still have debates over nativism against new immigrants about how long they should stay in the United States before they can become naturalized. And with political machines, it started in the previous period with Tammany Hall. There are movements for reforming these political machines, for them to have less power in appointing patronage jobs. And so after President Garfield is assassinated by a office seeker, there is a law that is passed that is going to take some of that power away and is going to make the bureaucracy more into a meritocracy. We have laissez-faire government policies, and labor unions and reformers are beginning to protest those. All right, so I know that was long. This historical period itself is going to be long, but here's the recap of everything that happened. The economy quickly expanded due to technological innovations. It creates a class of mega-rich captains of industry, or robber barons, if you want to call them that. Debates over the economy dominated labor unions and new political parties. Immigration from abroad and rural areas grew the size and importance of cities. Expansion in the West brought on conflicts with natives. Diverse intellectual and cultural movements dominated with increased communication. And finally, reform efforts continue over segregation, women's suffrage, temperance, and corruption in government. All right. Thank you for sticking through it. I know that was long, but now that we've covered all of the context, we'll be able to move into each historical topic individually and talk more in depth. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next lecture.